The sun had barely risen over the wide Wyoming plains when Luke McGraw swung open the creaking door of his barn. The morning air carried the scent of dew and sagebrush, the same scent that had filled his life for years, unchanged, unbroken, and unbearably empty. 10 years had passed since the day his wife Clara disappeared in a river accident that should never have happened. Yet even now, Luke still set 2 plates on the breakfast table out of habit, one for himself and one that remained untouched. The ranch, once alive with laughter and music, now stood like a monument to grief. Faded curtains fluttered in the breeze, and dust settled thick on the piano Clara once played every Sunday evening. Luke had sealed her dresses in a cedar chest, but the faint scent of her lilac perfume still lingered in the air whenever he walked past. It was both comfort and torment, a whisper from a life he couldn't let go of. Neighbors came less and less over the years. At first they brought casseroles and sympathy, offering company and prayer, but grief has a way of turning company into silence, and silence into solitude. Luke began turning down invitations, stopped going to church, and eventually learned to live with nothing but the wind, his cattle, and his ghosts. The townsfolk spoke kindly of him, a good man, a heartbroken man, but when they saw his shadow riding across the hills at dusk, they said he looked like someone chasing something he could never catch. Every night Luke rode out to the Cottonwood River, the place where Clara's buggy had been found overturned, her bonnet tangled in the reeds. They never found her body, only that bonnet, and a ribbon she used to tie her hair. The sheriff told him the current could have swept her miles downstream, maybe even to the canyon gorge. Luke never believed that. In his heart, he clung to the faint hope that maybe she had survived somehow, hurt, lost, taken in by strangers. But after 10 long winters, even hope began to feel like cruelty. He kept the ranch running out of duty, not joy. The land had been his father's and grandfather's before him, and he couldn't abandon it, even if it no longer felt like home. His days followed a rhythm as steady as the ticking of the old mantle clock. Wake before dawn, tend the horses, mend fences, herd cattle, eat alone, and ride the perimeter at sunset. The monotony numbed him, and maybe that's why he kept at it, because routine dulled the ache that memories sharpened. On certain evenings, when the wind died and the prairie lay quiet, Luke swore he could hear her voice, soft, calling his name across the fields. Sometimes he'd turn, half expecting to see her standing by the barn door in her blue gingham dress, smiling the way she used to. But there was only the wind, whispering through the grass, playing tricks on a lonely man's heart. Inside the small wooden house, the evidence of her still surrounded him. The embroidered handkerchief she'd left unfinished, the wedding portrait on the mantel, the rocking chair by the window that creaked when the wind pushed against it. Luke never moved a thing. He couldn't. It felt wrong to erase her, even if she was long gone. To the outside world, Luke McGraw was a man carved from stone. Quiet, hard-working, dependable. But inside, he was hollowed out, living half a life. Every sunrise reminded him of another day without her. Every sunset reminded him of how long he'd been alone. And yet, beneath all the sorrow, there lingered one fragile truth he never spoke aloud. If Clara had truly died, he would have felt it. Somewhere, deep in his soul, a sliver of faith still flickered, weak but alive. He couldn't explain it, but he knew he wasn't finished waiting. That morning, as Luke tightened the cinch on his old chestnut mare and rode out toward the horizon, he had no way of knowing that the wait was nearly over. Within a week, the silence he'd lived with for 10 long years would be shattered by the voices of 2 young girls who carried her eyes, her smile, and a story that would change everything he thought he knew about loss, love, and the past. The town of Willow Creek had long since stopped talking openly about Luke McGraw's tragedy, but his name still carried a kind of reverent sorrow. To the older folks, he was a living reminder of how love could break a man and leave him walking, talking, breathing, but never living. The younger ones only knew the stories. how his wife Clara had vanished one stormy night, how he still rode to the riverbank every week as if waiting for her ghost to rise from the water. The Cottonwood River flowed gently that morning, its silver surface reflecting the pale sky. Luke sat on his horse, staring at the spot where her carriage had overturned. The river had changed over the years. New banks carved by flood waters, the cottonwoods taller and denser. But to him, it always looked the same. The same cold water, the same lonely silence. He'd never found her body. The search party had scoured the river for days, dragging it with ropes and nets. They found pieces of wood, a woman's glove, and her ribbon. Nothing more. The sheriff had finally said what everyone dreaded. "She's gone, Luke. The current took her." But Luke couldn't accept that. Some part of him believed that if he just kept coming back, the truth would show itself. Rumors had spread over the years. Some said Clara ran off, maybe with another man, maybe to escape something she couldn't bear. Others whispered about bandits on the road, or that she'd been kidnapped. Luke ignored all of it, but the whispers never stopped. In small towns, tragedy becomes legend, and legends grow teeth. At the Rusty Spur Saloon, men sometimes told newcomers that the McGraw Ranch was haunted, that on moonless nights you could see a woman in white by the river holding a lantern and calling a name the wind carried away. Some even swore they'd seen her shadow in Luke's window, standing behind him while he ate alone. Luke himself never spoke of ghosts. He didn't have to. His silence said everything. Back at the ranch, the loneliness had become a living thing. It filled every room, every breath. The ticking of the mantel clock, the creak of floorboards, the whistle of wind through the rafters, all sounded louder in her absence. He'd talk to his horse sometimes, or to the fire when it crackled. But no matter what he said, the silence always answered back. That autumn, the prairie was dry and brittle, the grass turning gold under a sun that seemed to burn slower than it used to. Luke's neighbors, Earl and Mary Carter, stopped by one day with a basket of preserves and an invitation to supper. He thanked them, but declined, as he always did. Mary gave him a look of quiet pity, the same one everyone gave him. They meant well, but Luke didn't need pity. What he needed, he couldn't name. That night, as the wind howled through the open plains, Luke stood on the porch and looked toward the horizon. The stars shimmered cold and distant. He thought about Clara, her laughter, her soft hands, the way she'd lean into him during thunderstorms. He tried to remember her voice, but after 10 years, even memory betrays the heart. The details fade, leaving only the ache. And yet, the ache was proof she'd been real. Proof that love once lived here. When the wind picked up, it carried something strange, almost like a whisper, faint but clear. Luke. It was so real he stepped off the porch, scanning the darkness. But there was nothing. Only the tall grass bending in the breeze, the endless hum of the plains. Still, his heart pounded like it used to when she'd surprise him from behind. He closed his eyes and let the wind wash over him. He didn't know it then, but that whisper wasn't just memory. It was the world stirring, the past shifting toward him once more. The same wind that carried her name would soon carry something else, a sound he hadn't heard in 10 long years. Children's voices, 2 of them, calling for help. And by the time Luke heard them, it would already be too late to turn away. The morning came gray and cold, the kind of prairie dawn that felt suspended between night and day. Mist clung low over the fields, and the horizon burned faintly gold where the sun fought to rise. Luke McGraw was already saddled up before first light, riding the fence line as he did every morning, a habit carved deep into him by grief and discipline. He didn't expect anything different from this day. For 10 years, nothing ever was. But fate often arrives quietly, like a whisper in the wind before the storm. As Luke reached the far edge of his property, he noticed a strange sight near the old East Trail, a broken-down wagon, its wheels half sunk in the mud. It looked abandoned, but smoke rose faintly from a small campfire beside it. His instincts stirred. Strangers were rare in these parts, and those who came unannounced often meant trouble. He dismounted, hand resting on the butt of his revolver, and walked closer. The wagon was weather-worn, its paint chipped, and its canvas torn from wind and travel. A faint rustling came from inside, followed by a weak cough. Luke pulled back the flap and froze. Inside, huddled together under a threadbare blanket, were two little girls, twins, no older than 8 or 9. Their faces were pale, their clothes dusty, their hair tangled from days on the road. But what stopped Luke cold were their eyes, clear, deep green, bright even in the morning gloom. The exact same color as Clara's eyes. For a long moment, Luke just stood there, unable to breathe. His heart thudded hard enough to shake his chest. The younger girl, frightened, clutched a small wooden doll close to her chest. The older one met his gaze without flinching, her voice small but steady. "Mister, are you the man from the ranch?" Luke blinked. "That's right. Who are you girls? Where are your folks?" The older one glanced at her sister before answering. "We don't got any folks now. Mama's gone." Something in her tone, a quiet finality, hit him like a hammer. He swallowed hard, trying to steady himself. "Gone where?" "She got sick. Before the last town," the younger one whispered. Her voice trembled. "She told us to keep going west, to find a man named Luke McGraw. She said he'd help us." The world seemed to tilt beneath Luke's boots. For 10 years he'd lived in silence, clinging to a ghost. And now 2 living, breathing children were sitting in front of him, calling his name from the lips of a dying woman who knew who he was. He knelt beside the wagon, searching their faces. Every detail clawed at his heart, the shape of their noses, the freckles across their cheeks, the way their eyes reflected both innocence and something achingly familiar. "Your mama," he said carefully. "What was her name?" The older girl reached into her pocket and pulled out a tarnished locket, its hinge rusted but still intact. She placed it in Luke's rough, trembling hand. "She said it was from you," the girl whispered. "Her name was Clara May." The locket fell open. Inside, under a layer of dust, was a small, faded photograph of Clara, smiling in the summer light, her arm around Luke the day they were married. For a long time, the only sound was the wind brushing through the grass. Luke's throat tightened, his vision blurring. 10 years of mourning, 10 years of emptiness, all unraveling in an instant. These girls weren't strangers. They were the pieces of Clara he thought he'd lost forever. He took a deep breath, the kind that seemed to scrape the air out of his lungs, and forced himself to speak. "You two, you stay here. I'll get some food, some blankets. You're safe now." The older girl nodded, relief softening her face. The younger one smiled faintly, her small fingers clutching the edge of his sleeve, like she'd found something she'd been looking for all along. As Luke walked back toward his horse, the sun finally broke through the mist, spilling golden light over the wagon and the 2 girls inside. For the first time in a decade, Luke felt the warmth of mourning not as punishment, but as promise. He didn't yet understand who they were, or what cruel twist of fate had brought them to him. But deep down, one truth stirred like a heartbeat beneath the earth. The past wasn't done with him yet. The kitchen smelled of coffee and wood smoke as Luke McGraw poured hot water into a tin cup, his hands trembling slightly. Across the table sat the 2 girls, Emma and Lila, as they had introduced themselves, bundled in his late wife's old quilt, their faces pale from exhaustion and the cold. It had been a long night. He'd fed them soup, given them a place to sleep in the spare room, and stoked the fire till the house was warm again. But his mind hadn't rested for a moment. That name, Clara May, echoed through his thoughts like a bell tolling in a hollow canyon. He'd spoken it so many times in prayer and grief, but never like this. never followed by the voices of children who carried her eyes. As morning light crept through the window, Luke studied them more closely. Emma, the elder by a few minutes, had Clara's same determined brow, the same quiet intelligence in her gaze. Lila, softer and smaller, had her mother S. dimple and a way of tilting her head that made Luke S. heart twist. Every gesture, every word brought Clara back to life before his eyes, until he could hardly tell where memory ended and reality began. He cleared his throat, voice rough. "You said your mama sent you to find me. Did she tell you why?" Emma shook her head, fingers tracing the edge of the locket on the table. "She said you'd understand, that you'd take care of us. She said you were our daddy." The words hit him harder than a rifle's kick. Luke froze, his breath caught between disbelief and desperate hope. "What did you say?" The girl looked up at him, steady. "You're our daddy. Mama told us before she died. She said you didn't know about us, but you would have come for us if you did." Luke sat back in his chair, staring at the two faces that now seemed to blur with the woman he deburied in his heart. It didn't seem possible. And yet, deep inside, something fit. Something that explained the unending ache, the dreams that had never stopped. His mind raced back to that terrible day 10 years ago. The overturned carriage, the river, the frantic search. What if Clara hadn't died at all? What if she'd been alive, hurt and afraid, carrying their children and hiding for reasons he couldn't yet understand? He picked up the locket again, tracing the curve of Clara's face in the tiny photograph. The sight of it split him open. Love, guilt, confusion, all tangled together. "Where did you and your mama come from?" he asked gently. Lila answered this time, her voice soft. "From a town called Red Hollow. Mama worked in a dress shop there. We left when she got sick. She said we had to keep going west, till we found you." "Red Hollow," Luke repeated, brow furrowing. It was nearly 200 miles away. Clara could have lived there for years, just beyond reach, close enough for him to feel her shadow but never know the truth. He rose from his chair and paced the kitchen, his boots echoing against the wooden floor. His whole world had been built on the belief that Clara was gone. Now, the foundation of that grief was cracking apart. When he turned back, Emma was holding something else out to him, a folded, yellowed piece of paper. "Mama said to give you this." He took it with unsteady hands and unfolded it. Inside was a short note written in Clara's looping hand. "Luke, if you ever find them, know that I never stopped loving you. I had to disappear to keep them safe. Forgive me. C." The room seemed to spin. Luke sank into a chair, staring at the letter as tears he didn't know he had left welled in his eyes. The fire crackled softly, filling the silence. He looked up at the twins, his daughters, and saw not just the reflection of Clara's eyes, but the continuation of her soul. They were proof that love could survive even death's cruel deception. For the first time in a decade, Luke McGraw smiled, not because the pain was gone, but because the memory he'd mourned for so long was suddenly reborn before him. That night, after the twins had fallen asleep in the spare room, Luke McGraw sat alone by the dying fire. The ranch was quiet except for the ticking of the clock and the soft rustle of the wind outside. He held Clara's letter in one hand and the locket in the other, staring at them as though they might somehow speak if he only stared long enough. For 10 years he had lived believing that death had stolen his wife from him. Now it turned out that life and secrets had done the job instead. Clara hadn't died. She had run. But why? What could have frightened her so deeply that she chose to vanish, to raise their daughters in hiding, rather than come home? Luke rubbed a hand over his face. The letter offered no answers, only love and apology. "I had to disappear to keep them safe." The words looped through his mind, over and over, until the fire burned down to embers. Safe from what? Or from whom? By morning, he'd made up his mind. There was only one man who might know more. Doc Henry, the old physician who Eddie delivered half the babies in Willow Creek and had been there when Clara disappeared. Henry had been a family friend since Luke was a boy, and if anyone had seen or heard something strange back then, it would be him. Luke saddled his horse and rode into town with the sunrise painting the plains in orange and gold. The wind was sharp and dry, carrying the smell of dust and distant rain. It had been years since he'd ridden this road with purpose. When he reached the small faded building with H. Warren, M.D. painted above the door, the old doctor nearly dropped his spectacles at the sight of him. "Luke McGraw!" Henry exclaimed. Haven't seen you in near a decade. You look like a man with ghosts on his heels." Luke didn't smile. He stepped inside, holding the letter out. "You might say that, Doc. I need the truth about the day Clara disappeared." The old man's eyes softened, but there was caution in them, too. "After all this time?" "After all this time," Luke said quietly. Henry motioned for him to sit, then poured 2 cups of coffee. "I remember it well. You were frantic. The river was high that spring, and everyone figured her buggy slipped near the bend. But—" he hesitated, his voice lowering. "A week before she vanished, Clara came to see me. She wasn't hurt, just worried. She asked about traveling while expecting." Luke's cup stopped halfway to his lips. "Expecting?" Henry nodded slowly. "She was with child, Luke. 2, actually. I told her it was early, barely noticeable, but she smiled like it was the greatest secret in the world. I assumed she'd tell you soon enough." The words hit like a blow. The twins, Emma and Lila. They had been on their way long before the river ever took her. Luke's mind reeled. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I tried," Henry said, setting his cup down heavily. "But the sheriff closed the case fast, said she'd drowned. I thought you knew." The room fell silent except for the faint ticking of the wall clock. Luke stared at the floorboards, his jaw tight. Pregnant. Alone. Running from something. Or someone. "Doc," he said finally, his voice rough. "Did Clara ever say who she was afraid of?" Henry hesitated, then sighed. "She didn't name anyone, but I remember her hands were shaking. She said someone had been threatening her about a land claim. Said if she didn't sign some papers, they'd make her disappear. She wouldn't say who. Just that it wasn't safe. Not even for you." Luke rose slowly, his stomach churning. Everything was coming apart. And yet finally things began to make sense. The night she vanished hadn't been an accident. Someone had wanted her gone. He looked out the window, watching the sun sink low behind the town rooftops. His wife had run to protect their unborn daughters. She had given up her life with him to keep them safe. And now whoever had driven her to that desperate choice might still be out there. Luke turned back to Henry, his voice quiet but firm. "Thank you, Doc. I reckon it's time I found out who wanted her gone." As he stepped outside, the wind rose again. Restless, warning, almost alive. The truth was no longer buried. It was waking, and it was coming for him. The ride back to the ranch was long and silent, the prairie stretching endlessly under a burning sky. Luke McGraw's mind was a storm. The doctor's words echoed like gunfire in his head. She was pregnant. She said someone wanted her gone. For 10 years, he'd lived chained to grief, mourning a tragedy that wasn't an accident at all. His wife hadn't been taken by the river. She had been driven to it. The thought made his blood run cold. As his horse trotted along the dirt road, Luke's eyes swept across the wide-open land. This was his inheritance, the McGraw Ranch, acres of soil and sweat built by generations before him. Land like this was worth more than gold in Wyoming. Plenty of men would kill for it. But who had threatened Clara? Who would have wanted to make her disappear? When he reached the homestead, twilight had already painted the sky in bruised shades of purple and red. The twins, Emma and Lila, were sitting on the porch, brushing the mane of an old pony. They looked up and waved as he approached, their faces bright against the fading light. The sight of them tugged at something deep inside him, a mix of love, awe, and sorrow, and they were living proof of what Clara had endured to keep them safe. Luke tied his horse to the post and climbed the porch steps, his boots heavy with dust. "You two girls behave while I was gone?" Emma grinned. "We made biscuits. They're a little burnt, though." He chuckled softly for the first time in what felt like years. "I've burned worse. Don't worry." As they went inside, Luke's eyes fell on the small locket sitting on the mantel. He picked it up again, turning it over between his fingers. There was something etched faintly on the back, a name he hadn't noticed before. The engraving was worn, but under the flickering lamplight he could make it out, J. Barrett & Co. His heart stopped. Jed Barrett. The name clawed through his memory like a buried snake. He hadn't thought of Barrett in years, a slick-talking speculator who, to come through Willow Creek just before Clara vanished. Barrett had been trying to buy up land from every rancher in the valley, promising money, roads, and rail access. But Luke had refused. The McGraw Ranch wasn't for sale, not then, not ever. Clara had despised the man, too. She'd said once that his eyes were cold and his smile never reached them. A chill crept up Luke's spine. Could Barrett have been the one who threatened her? He sat at the table, the locket in his palm, the pieces of the puzzle falling slowly into place. If Barrett had coerced Clara, tried to force her to sign something while Luke was away, it might explain everything. The fear, the sudden disappearance, the letter years later begging for forgiveness. He poured himself a cup of coffee and stared into the dark liquid, his reflection rippling on the surface. Clara must have been terrified. Pregnant, alone, and knowing someone powerful wanted her gone. She hadn't run from him. She'd run for him, for their children. In the next room, Emma and Lila giggled softly, whispering secrets in the way sisters do. Their laughter filled the house like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Luke closed his eyes, letting the sounds settle over him. Clara had saved that laughter. She had given everything to protect it. But if Jed Barrett was still alive, and Luke was sure he was, then the danger wasn't gone. The same man who driven Clara into hiding might one day come looking for what she left behind. Luke rose from his chair and walked to the window. The moon had risen over the plains, casting a pale glow over the barn and the open fields beyond. Somewhere out there the past was still waiting, watching. He swore quietly under his breath. "I couldn't save you, Clara, but I'll protect them. I swear it." That night, as the twins slept peacefully in the room that once belonged to their mother, Luke sat awake by the fire with his rifle across his knees. The old house creaked softly, but he didn't move. He had buried the past once. Now the past was clawing its way back, and this time he was ready to face it. The next few days passed in uneasy peace. Luke McGraw worked the ranch with a quiet determination, fixing fences, tending horses, and pretending life was normal. But beneath the calm, his mind churned. Every time he saw Emma and Lila playing in the yard, he thought of Clara, of the fear she must have carried while protecting them. The locket's engraving, J. Barrett & Co., haunted him like a brand burned into his thoughts. By the third morning, the first real sign of trouble arrived. Luke was unloading hay in the barn when a dust cloud appeared on the road, a lone rider, approaching fast. The sun caught the man's hat brim, glinting off a silver buckle and the butt of a pistol strapped low on his hip. Luke's instincts tensed. Visitors were rare out this way, and unannounced ones rarer still. The stranger reined in his horse near the gate. He was tall, sharp-featured, dressed in fine clothes that didn't belong on the prairie. His eyes were dark, restless, and calculating, the kind of eyes Luke remembered too well. "Well, I'll be," the man said, dismounting with a smirk. "If it isn't Luke McGraw, 10 years and you're still hiding out on this godforsaken patch of dirt." Luke's jaw tightened. "Don't recall sending for you, Barrett." Jed Barrett laughed, brushing the dust from his coat. "No, I imagine you didn't. But business brings me back to these parts. I was passing through, thought I'd pay my respects. Heard your wife met an unfortunate end some years back. Terrible thing." Luke's hands clenched at his sides. The man's tone was casual, but there was poison beneath it. "You'd know more about that than most," Luke said evenly. Barrett tilted his head, smiling thinly. "Now that sounds like an accusation, friend." "I'm not your friend." Silence fell between them, thick as the dust. The horses snorted nervously in the distance. Luke could feel the weight of the revolver at his hip, but didn't he move for it? Not yet. Barrett finally shrugged. "I didn't come to stir up ghosts, Luke. I just want what's mine." Luke frowned. "And what would that be?" "Some personal property that went missing years ago. Belonged to a woman named Clara May. You might have heard of her." His smile widened, and the chill in Luke's chest turned to fire. "I don't know what you're talking about," Luke said, though his voice carried an edge sharp enough to cut. Barrett's eyes narrowed. "Oh, I think you do. She had something of mine, something valuable. Papers, a deed. You know how women can be, keeping secrets they shouldn't. She took off before our business was finished. Shame what happened to her." Luke's pulse thundered in his ears. Business. That word told him everything. Barrett had threatened Clara, forced her to flee. She hadn't drowned. She'd run from this man. Barrett took a slow step forward, lowering his voice. "If anything she had ends up here, letters, documents, a trinket or two, you'd best hand it over. Otherwise—" His hand brushed the pistol on his belt. "Trouble has a way of finding people who keep what's not theirs." Luke met his gaze without flinching. "You come near this ranch again, Barrett, and you'll find trouble waiting." The man chuckled, mounting his horse. "Careful, McGraw. I've buried men for less." He tugged the reins and rode off, dust curling behind him like smoke from a fire that wouldn't die. Luke stood there long after he was gone, the wind tugging at his coat. Rage burned through him, not wild, but cold and steady. Barrett's return wasn't a coincidence. He was looking for something Clara had hidden. And if the man thought Luke would hand it over, he'd made the gravest mistake of his life. When Luke went back inside, the girls were at the table coloring with charcoal on paper. They looked up at him, innocent and smiling, unaware that the shadow of their mother's past had just ridden up to their door. He forced a calm smile. "Finish up, girls. We're going to lock the place up tight tonight." As the sun sank, Luke checked his rifle, lit the lanterns, and bolted every door. He had buried grief for 10 long years, but now grief had turned to resolve. Jed Barrett had taken Clara once. He wouldn't take anything else, not while Luke McGraw still drew breath. The sky that evening looked like iron, dark, heavy, and waiting to break. Thunder rolled low over the prairie, a warning that a storm was brewing. But inside Luke McGraw's chest, the real storm had already begun. He'd seen Jed Barrett's kind before, smooth talkers with dead eyes, men who believed they owned whatever they could take. Barrett hadn't come for old papers. He'd come for whatever Clara had hidden all those years ago, and if she'd died protecting it, then it had to be something worth killing for. Luke stood by the barn, checking the locks, tightening the shutters. Every few minutes, his gaze drifted toward the house where Emma and Lila were reading by lamplight. The warm glow spilling through the window felt fragile, like a candle flame flickering in the dark. The first drops of rain began to fall, slow, heavy, and cold. He was just about to head inside when the horses spooked. They snorted and stomped, eyes rolling white. Luke turned sharply toward the road. Lightning flashed, and in that split-second blaze of light he saw movement. 3 riders, maybe 4, coming fast through the rain. "Barrett," Luke muttered under his breath. He bolted to the porch, threw open the door, and called to the girls, "Get to the back room now! Don't come out till I say!" Emma's face went pale. "Daddy, go!" His tone left no room for argument. As the twins scrambled down the hall, Luke grabbed his Winchester from the rack above the door and took position by the window. Through the sheets of rain, he could see them clearly now. Barrett and 2 hired guns, their slickers glistening, their horses kicking up mud as they rode in hard. Lightning split the sky again, followed by thunder that shook the house. The storm had come. Barrett's voice carried over the wind. "Luke, don't make this difficult. Hand over what's mine, and no one gets hurt." Luke leaned out slightly, shouting back, "You've got no business here. Turn around before I make you regret it." Barrett laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. "You always were stubborn. Shame your wife learned the hard way." The words lit a fuse in Luke's heart. He didn't wait. He fired. The shot cracked through the rain, hitting one of Barrett's men square in the shoulder. The man toppled from his horse, screaming. Barrett cursed and ducked behind a water trough, returning fire. Bullets splintered the porch railing. Inside, Emma and Lila huddled beneath a blanket, clutching each other as thunder and gunfire blended into one unholy roar. Luke reloaded and fired again, the rifle kicking hard against his shoulder. The storm howled like a living thing, wind slamming against the windows, lightning slicing the horizon in jagged flashes. Barrett's men returned fire, one bullet grazing Luke's hat brim, another shattering the front window. "McGraw!" Barrett shouted between thunderclaps. "You can't win this! You're outnumbered!" Luke gritted his teeth. "I ain't outnumbered. Not on my land." Another flash, and Luke caught sight of Barrett moving toward the barn, likely trying to flank him. Luke ducked through the back door, rain pelting his face, mud sucking at his boots. He circled behind the barn, rifle raised. Barrett appeared on the far side, pistol in hand, just as lightning struck nearby, lighting the scene like a photograph. Their eyes met. "It didn't have to end this way," Barrett snarled. "It did the moment you came for her." They fired almost at the same time. Barrett's shot went wide. Luke's didn't. The bullet hit Barrett square in the chest and he stumbled back, dropping his gun into the mud. He tried to speak, but the rain drowned his words. Moments later, he fell face first into the earth. Luke stood there breathing hard, soaked through, the thunder rolling above him like a drumbeat for the dead. The other hired gun fled into the darkness, leaving only hoofbeats and rain behind. When Luke finally went back inside, the twins ran to him. He dropped to his knees, wrapping his arms around them both. "It's over," he whispered, though his voice shook. "You're safe now." Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the old ranch house, something had broken free. The fear that had bound them all for 10 long years was finally over. As lightning flickered through the window, Luke looked toward the mantel where Clara's letter still rested. Her words echoed softly in his mind. "I had to disappear to keep them safe." He closed his eyes and whispered into the quiet, "You did, Clara. You did." And somewhere beyond the storm it felt like she finally heard him. The morning after the storm, the world looked washed clean, but the air was heavy with what had happened. The smell of gunpowder still lingered faintly around the barn, mixed with wet hay and earth. Luke McGraw hadn't slept. He sat on the porch as the sun rose, hat in his hands, watching mist drift over the prairie grass. Jed Barrett lay buried out beyond the north fence. Luke had done it himself before dawn. No prayers, no marker, just a shallow grave for a man who brought nothing but pain. But the act didn't bring peace. It only made the weight in Luke's chest settle deeper. When Emma and Lila came out, still sleepy-eyed, he forced a small smile. "How are my girls?" he asked. his voice soft but tired. "We're okay," Emma whispered. "You're not hurt?" "Not a scratch," Luke lied. There was a bruise along his ribs where a bullet had come close, but he'd survived worse. What mattered now were the two little lives looking up at him. They sat beside him, and for a while they just listened to the morning sounds, the wind through the grass, the groan of a windmill turning, a lone crow calling far off. The world felt both new and old again. After breakfast, Luke saddled his horse and rode into town. He couldn't keep what happened a secret, even if he wanted to. Barrett had friends, and sooner or later, someone would come asking questions. When he arrived, the sheriff, a grizzled man named Tom Reeves, who'd known Luke since boyhood, met him outside the office. "Heard shots out your way last night," Reeves said, squinting. "Was that Barrett?" Luke nodded. "He came looking for something Clara had hidden. Brought 2 men. Didn't leave with either." The sheriff sighed, rubbing his jaw. "You know this won't sit well with the Barrett family. But you did right by defending your home." Luke handed over the locket he'd found, the one with the J. Barrett & Co. engraving. Inside, behind the photograph, was a folded strip of paper. "He wasn't looking for gold," Luke said. "He wanted this." Reeves unfolded it carefully. His eyes widened as he read. "Land rights. Signed over to Clara May McGraw. This here proves she owned half the Barrett property. Legally." Luke frowned. "She never told me." "She probably couldn't," the sheriff replied. "If Barrett found out she had these papers, he'd have killed her sooner. My guess? She hid the deed before she ran. Maybe she was coming back for it when she disappeared." Luke stared at the document. It was like touching a ghost, proof that Clara had lived in courage, even when cornered by fear. The sheriff folded it again and handed it back. "You keep it. It's hers. And now it's theirs." When Luke rode home, the clouds were breaking. Sunlight shimmered across the wet fields. Emma and Lila were outside, hanging laundry on the line, their laughter rising with the wind. For the first time, it didn't sound like an echo of the past. It sounded like life starting again. He walked to them, placing the folded deed into Emma's small hands. "This belonged to your mother," he said. "She fought hard to make sure you'd have a home. You both did her proud." The girls looked up at him, their eyes, Clara's eyes, bright with emotion. Lila hugged him tightly. "Are we going to stay here, Daddy?" Luke smiled faintly. "Yeah, sweetheart. This land's ours now. No one's taken it away." That night, as twilight stretched across the prairie, Luke stood by Clara's old headstone behind the house. He'd carved a new one beside it that morning, for Clara May, who lived brave and loved true. He placed the locket between them, letting it rest in the grass. "You can rest easy now," he murmured. "They're safe, and I'll take care of them, just like you wanted." The wind moved softly through the wildflowers, almost like a whisper in return. For the first time in 10 years, Luke felt the quiet settle in his bones, not the kind born of loneliness, but of peace. The storm had taken much from him, but it had also given something back: truth, family, and a reason to live again. As the stars came out over the darkening plains, Luke turned toward the house where 2 girls waited inside, his daughters, his future, and walked home. Winter melted slowly into spring, and with it, Luke McGraw's ranch began to change, just as he had. The grass grew greener, the fences stood straighter, and laughter returned to the old house like birds finding their way home. The ghosts that once haunted every corner of the place had quieted, leaving behind something gentler: peace. Each morning, Luke woke before dawn to start chores, and when he came back to the kitchen, Emma and Lila would already be waiting, their hair tied with ribbons, eager to help. The two had settled into life on the ranch as if they'd always belonged there. They fed chickens, helped mend tack, and sometimes sang while hanging laundry in the wind, songs their mother used to sing. One afternoon, while fixing the barn roof, Luke paused to watch them playing near the old apple tree. The sunlight caught in their hair, the same chestnut shade as Clara's, and something deep inside him eased. He'd spent 10 years mourning his wife, chasing memories that cut like barbed wire. Now, every time he looked at those girls, he didn't just see what he'd lost, he saw what he still had. The townsfolk, too, began to notice the change. They'd long whispered about the widower who lived alone out past the ridge, but now when Luke came to town with the twins in tow, the stares softened. The blacksmith's wife gave the girls cookies. The teacher offered them books. Folks who once pitied Luke now nodded in quiet respect. One day, Sheriff Tom Reeves rode up to the ranch. He dismounted slow, his hat in his hand. "Heard from Barrett's kin," he said. "They're not coming after you. Seems word got around that Jed was in the wrong." His brother signed the rest of their land over to the county, said he wanted no part of it. Luke exhaled, the weight lifting from his chest. "Then it's finished." "It's finished," Reeves agreed. "You did right by Clara. She'd be proud." After the sheriff rode off, Luke walked to the hill where Clara's headstone stood. Wildflowers had begun to bloom around it, tiny yellow ones that the girls picked every few days to lay there. He knelt, brushing a hand across the carved letters. "I reckon it's time we all moved forward," he said softly. "But I'll never forget." That evening, the family shared supper on the porch. The air smelled of rain and lilacs, and the sky burned gold and rose over the plains. Lila leaned against Luke's shoulder, while Emma read aloud from one of the new books. The moment was simple, but to Luke, it felt sacred. When the stars began to appear, Emma closed the book and looked up. "Daddy, can you tell us about Mama again? The first time you met her?" Luke smiled. "Well," he said, voice low and warm, "she was trying to fix a wagon wheel by herself. I told her she was doing it all wrong. She told me to mind my own business. That's how I knew she was the one." The girls giggled, and Luke laughed too, a sound that had once been foreign to him but now came easy. Later that night, after tucking them in, Luke stepped outside again. The stars spread thick across the sky, the same way they had when he'd first kissed Clara under the cottonwoods years ago. The land stretched quiet and endless before him, the house behind glowing soft with lamplight. For the first time in a decade, the ranch didn't feel empty. It felt alive. He whispered into the night, "We're all right now, Clara. You can rest easy." And as a warm wind moved through the prairie grass, it seemed to carry a reply, faint but certain, as if her spirit still lingered somewhere in that vast western sky, watching over the home she'd fought so hard to give them. Luke turned back toward the house. Tomorrow would bring more chores, more laughter, maybe even more hope. But tonight, he let himself stand in the quiet, his heart finally unburdened. The ranch was no longer a place of sorrow. It was a promise kept, a home reborn.